Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through what I think are the greatest albums from 1985. I'm going to be ranking them, and what's special about this list is not only is it the greatest albums of 1985, but because it's now 2025, we are celebrating the 40th birthday this year of all these albums, aren't we? Which is something that YouTubers like to do at the beginning of the year. They're all doing it. Sea of Tranquility's doing it. Him over at the Prong Corner's doing it. They're all doing it. We're all celebrating the birthday albums. That's what we're doing. The 40th birthday. They're mainly doing 75 because that's where all the prog is. Because on my channel, I talk about all sorts of stuff. And I've done 85. I was 17 years old in 85. You know, so music was very important to me. But I tell you, not the music that was coming out in this year. Because in trying to go through this list, I had to scrap around. And also what was interesting, there's a couple of albums on here that would I put them in my favourite albums of all time? I don't know if I would, but there's a couple of albums on here that were very important to me at the time, right? And I've put them on. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I put them on, but back when I was 17 years old, these albums I played over and over again, and if I put them on now, I would absolutely love them. Those albums tend to be on the lower regions of this top 10, so we're going to be hitting them straight away. So should we just, go straight in? And at number 10, I have got, and it's one of those albums, which I'm not saying is the greatest album ever made, but for me, it's all I bloody listened to in 1985. It is Disturbing the Peace by Alcatrazz. I cover all sorts on this. So what's the hell's Alcatrazz? Alcatrazz was a sort of hair metal band that emerged in the early to mid-80s. It was fronted by the great Graham Bonnet that had come to fame singing for Rainbow. And had 2 hit records with Rainbow, All Night Long and Since You've Been Gone. Of course, Since You've Been Gone goes on to become one of the biggest rock staples of all time, so it secures Graham Bonnet as being a bit of a superstar. Of course, Graham Bonnet, and we could see this when he joined Rainbow, he didn't look like a rocker, did he? He's much more in the sort of soul R&B thing. But when he puts a band together, he still remains in that sphere, and he has ever since. And that's, I think, is because he has one of the most powerful voices in the history of rock. He puts this band together of almost like a super group, virtuoso band. And on the first album that they do, they've got Yngwie Malmsteen on guitar, and that propels Yngwie Malmsteen to superstar. No one can believe what Yngwie was doing, and he buggers off. So they go into the studio to make this second album, and they have to find somebody to play it. So they look around, and there's this guy that's been played in Frank Zappa that's pretty handy on guitar, Steve Vai. Now, at this point, I discovered Yngwie Malmsteen. I thought he was great. But I'd heard on the radio Call It Sleep by Steve Vai, and it had absolutely changed my life. And I'd gone searching for this album, and I'd found it, and I'd managed to pick up a copy of Flexible. I'd also bought Steve Vai. He'd made the album Them or Us that came out at a similar time, and I'd heard that as well, and heard Stevie spanking. So I was a Steve Vai nut. So I went to check this album out, and I bought it because it was a mainstream album with Steve Vai on. And Steve Vai had been deeply involved in this album. And although it's full of sort of commercial FM, sort of what's going to be called glam metal, and it is that type of stuff, but it has the genius of Steve Vai on it. It's incredible, and I just listened to it over and over again. I'd left school and just gone to college in 85, 86, and so I used to drive to college in the morning, and I'd have my cassette tape. I'd recorded my final copy onto cassette tape, and I'd listen to it there, and I'd listen to it back. I know this album inside out. Vai's incredible on it. And he doesn't overplay as well. That's what's interesting to hear him in the pop context. I love what he'd done with in the rhythm parts. It's a beautiful album. The band's great. There's some really good songs. There's sort of the single that was God Bless video, which I love. I just love this album. I even tracked down this I had a bootleg VHS copy of them live in Japan. Now, what's interesting when you explore this album is that actually Vai wasn't. He wasn't. Everyone wanted Malmsteen. Malmsteen had blown everybody away. They go and do this album, come back out and tour. And, they've got Steve Vai walking out, and everyone's going, oh, who's this bloke? Where's Malmsteen? But I think this is where Vi sort of moves into the mainstream. He then jumps from this band the following year into David Lee Roth's band, becomes a superstar himself. It's White Snake, and then he does Passionate Warfare, which comes out in 1989, 1990, which is an instrumental guitar virtuoso album that sells over 1 million copies. And this is a very interesting, not discussed that much phenomenon. And Vi is there. Vi is a musical genius, and he does his own thing, and it's absolutely wonderful. But that was the album I loved. I've spent like 5 minutes on that one, so we get going. So that's Disturbing the Peace at number 10. At number 9, I have an album. I thought I had to represent neo-prog. Misplaced Childhood came out this year by Marillion. I know you all love Marillion here. I know you all wanted me to like Misplaced Childhood, and I don't. I was listening to neo-prog. I was interested in more than Marillion. I liked Palace, and I liked IQ. I didn't listen to these two bands that much, but I was aware of them. And they seem to be heavier and more virtuoso, I suppose. Obviously, this has a great influence on me in terms of not this album, which at number 9 is The Wake by IQ. Of course, this is 1985. 20 years later, in 2005, I would be joining IQ, and I would be playing live the tracks that are on this album. And I know all the IQ albums up until the one I'm playing on Frequency in 2008. Or 2007, I think it's 2008. All those albums up until then I know inside out, because when I joined IQ, I was continually getting told, oh, do you know the so-and-so track? And I didn't know it, and I'd have to go and learn it. So I got deeply into these albums. Now, with IQ, the whole neo-prog thing was a very do-it-yourself music style. It was a return back to prog by a bunch of younger musicians that were inspired by punk to do whatever they wanted to do. It is like punk prog, but not prog mixed with the style of punk, but prog made with the sort of homemade English do-it-yourself, this is how we won the war, that actually underpins the punk movement in 1977. It's this fascinating thing. And their first album they made, Tales from the Lush Attic, is an incredible album, but it's definitely a homemade affair, and you can tell that they're limited in budgets in terms of production. But they, I think at that point, IQ were living in a house together, and they had their big 8-track machine with it on, and they would basically just do master mixes onto cassette tape of about 20 cassette tapes throughout the week, and then at the weekend drive up to wherever it was up north and sell these cassette tapes, and with that it managed to pay and get them off the ground, and that's how Tales from the Lush Attic. There was actually a cassette only album, I think, before that. The Wake is where IQ really consolidate who they are. The production is way better, and it's just a masterpiece of neo-prog without a doubt. It enables them to get their major deal, and then when they go to the studio, then they do I Sitting Comfortably and Non-Silent, which are far more commercial. And then in the early 90s, they return to prog. Pete comes back into the band after, being replaced by Paul Minell. And in 91, when they do Ever, that's almost in a way the rebirth of IQ. And I felt when I was playing with IQ that I was part of that incarnation. And The Wake is something completely different. So for me, The Wake is the only well-produced representation of the 80s neo-prog IQ, if that makes sense. And it's just full of absolute masterpieces. It's a brilliant album. And so if you want a neo-prog album, go and check it out. I won't say too much more about it because, it's always strange putting a band in my top 10 when I've played it. And this is the only time it's ever going to happen anyway. So shall we move on? So at number 8, I've got The Dream of the Blue Turtles by Sting. Now, when you go back and listen to this now, it is a little bit 80s-ified. There is a lot of DX7 on there and lots of sort of reverby drums and lots of, you know, lush reverby backing vocals. It's all a bit 80s, you know. Now, Sting is one of my favourite musicians, songwriters. I believe the Police to be the greatest band that ever existed. There's never been a band like the Police. And in 1983, he'd called it a day. They'd split up, and he goes off on his way. Now, we're all wondering what Sting's going to do, because he's the main guy. He's dissolved it because he's now about to have his solo career. So what's Sting going to do? And what Sting does is very interesting. He's always been a jazz musician at heart, right? And he pulls together a band which is the cream of jazz at that time, the heaviest players.
The Flintstones was one of my favorites, though, all the time. The Flintstones. With the Flintstones. You know that Sting?
No.
Yes, you do.
Teach me.
All British people know the Flintstones. That's a lie.
When you're with the Flintstones.
Yeah, I know. We started singing in the wrong key.
Yeah, the Flintstones family.
And I remember, I knew all these musicians before I saw them. So he starts to pull these musicians together, and I read about this. I'm thinking, oh my God, what's Sting doing? Is he making a jazz rock album? He's got Darryl Jones on bass from Miles Davis Band. I know I've got him on Decoy, you know, and I've got him on all that incredible bass player. He's got Branford Marsalis. Now, Branford Marsalis was the brother of Wynton Marsalis, and they were playing all this straight hard bop. And Wynton didn't like the pop music. He didn't like the jazz fusion. What's happened to Branford? Did he jump ship to go and play with Sting? What the hell's going on? On drums, he got Omar Hakim from Weather Report. Yeah, that one. Couldn't believe it. On piano, you've got Kenny Kirkland. I mean, Kenny Kirkland was just one of the greatest. I would say in the top pianists of the last 40 years, the late, great Kenny Kirkland, you know, who died around about 1999. Such a crime. It's terrible because he really was such an incredible player. An acoustic piano player, also playing with Wynton, and he's turning up with a synth and playing with Sting. So this album comes out, right? Now, at this time, I was buying records. This album is so special to me, this Dream with the Blue Turtles, because at this point, I was buying vinyl records and CDs had come out. I didn't want to buy a CD player, but I'd gone down the shop and they'd got this small selection of CDs, and they got Al Di Meola's Tour de Force, which you couldn't get on vinyl. So I decided to buy a CD player just to buy Al Di Meola's Tour de Force. But when this album comes out, 85, I've got now my new CD player. So I then go down and go, right, I'm going to buy the Sting album. This is really important. It's got all these jazz players on, and I'm going to buy it on CD. And this album was all produced. It's got all the 80s production. And I can remember coming home, putting the CD on, which we were all astonished because it was so much fuller and brighter, and it was like going into 3D. And this album was perhaps the first album I heard that had that sort of super production on it. Now, listening back to it now, I think the engineers didn't quite know how to mix for CD, and it's I think this album could actually do with a remix. But at the time, it was absolutely incredible. Now, on this album, it's actually very eclectic, and it wasn't what I expected, which was Sting singing over what sounded like Weather Report. It wasn't like that before. What Sting's doing here is setting up this idea that if you want musicians in your band to play rock music or pop music, you go towards the jazz. And Omar then gets the gig with Madonna. Darryl Jones then gets the gig with Rolling Stones, and he's been in that band since then. It's really interesting time. Now, tracks like Fortress Around My Heart, I think, is a peak of Sting's songwriting. It's so sophisticated. Tracks like We Work the Black Seam Together utilise the jazz musicians in such an incredible way. On the what's the one about the First World War, and then it relates to the heroin. Can't remember what that's called, but in the middle of that, it opens up into sort of post-Coltrane hard bop soloing. Never heard anything like that on a mainstream pop album. You got funky pop tracks like, if you love somebody, Set Them Free. You've got the classic Russians, which is one of Sting's great songs and sounds nothing like a group of jazz musicians in the room. It's really, really is a great album. I would love to get the original tapes, take all the reverb off, you know, maybe get some different keyboard sounds if you can. Some of the DX7 stuff's a little bit, you know, it's got electric pianos. It needs to be proper electric pianos. And if you just did that, this would be an absolute masterpiece. But just take the bloody reverb off. Let me hear Omar without all that reverb on. So that's what I've got at number 8 is Dream of the Blue Turtles by Sting. Let's move on to number 7. At number 7, I've got, by Marc Johnson, Bass Desires. Now, Marc Johnson had come to fame in the late 70s, early 80s, playing in the last incarnation of Bill Evans' trio. That's a hell of a place to start as a bass player. Bill Evans died in 1980. Marc Johnson then goes into the sort of burgeoning 80s jazz rock scene, which is actually pretty dire. And us jazz fusion fans are searching around. Now, Chicory's Electric Band comes out, 86. We get Blue Matter by Scofield. Those two albums are great, and I think they give fusion a bit of kick up the bum. But in 85, I mean, I went through, I really researched this. I'm going, God, this is all terrible. There's hardly anything worth listening to in 1985. And what's also interesting is that I go, Audit Cole must have done something. And when I go back to, gosh, that's not the one. And then other, you know, John McLaughlin, he must have done something. Oh, no, he didn't even make an album in 2005. So in 1985. So it's a really strange time. Now, the one label that's putting stuff out, and you're going to see this, the one label that has got some idea of quality and an artistic, you know, worth is ECM. And ECM is actually pushing the boundaries in what they do, because in the 70s they've become known as sort of producing sort of very acoustic improvisational albums. But Marc Johnson signs up and he forms this group called Bass Desires, which is him on double bass, Peter Erskine on drums, and then it's got 2 guitars up front. The incredible John Scofield and the incredible Bill Frisell. Somebody said to me, why don't you mention Bill Frisell on your channel? Do you not like Bill Frisell? I love Bill Frisell, but my Bill Frisell is from the 80s, and he's more avant-garde, he's more out there, he's playing guitar synth, and that's the Bill Frisell I like. When he starts to explore, and it's brilliant, but when he starts to explore the Americana thing, you know what I'm like, it's a little bit, I don't know. But he's an incredible guitarist. I like him. I think what it is with Bill Frisell, he's brilliant, but I like him playing on other people's stuff. My favourite Bill Frisell album is this, where he's put alongside Scofield, and those two together. It's just beautiful. No keyboard, it's 2 guitars up front. Quite a rare thing to happen in jazz. Bass Desires is one of the few great jazz fusion albums from 1985. I think I've got them all here, actually. Scofield is exploring that thing that he's doing at that time, which is that sort of post-Jim Hall, Wes Montgomery style of playing, but mixed with sort of the blues. And he's really, you know, going for that sort of almost B.B. King approach. Bill Frisell's a lot more abstract, so you really feel that there is the same as a piano and guitar or piano and saxophone that you normally get is covered in this. It's just a brilliant album. It's some really funky tracks out. There's solo on it. It's got that ECM production, which actually tampers down the sort of 80s aspect that ruins a lot of jazz fusion albums in this year. And so that's what I got on number 7, Bass Desires. And for me, that's my favourite Bill Frisell album. At number 6, I have Standards Volume 2 by Keith Jarrett. Keith Jarrett was doing all sorts of things on ECM records. You know, he's the fact that he'd sold about 6 million copies of the Colne concert, which came out in 1975, and secured the fact that he can do whatever he wants to do with ECM, and he's like puts loads of albums out, some quite esoteric albums. He forms what becomes one of his great groups, which is his piano trio with Jack DeJohnette on drums and Gary Peacock on double bass. And they go back to doing jazz standards. If you want to hear a piano trio playing jazz standards, this is the peak. This is it. This is the best there ever is. They brought out a volume 1, I think the year before, but Standards Volume 2 was the one. And I heard Never Let Me Go, their version of that off this album, and it just blew me away. Really indebted to the Bill Evans group, actually, which at the time I wasn't aware of. It's only recently that I've realised that those Bill Evans albums, especially the ones with Scott LaFaro, are some of the greatest albums ever made. And this explores that. It's also got elements of the avant-garde free jazz and a little bit of that sort of gospel-y Jarrett's version of jazz fusion. You know, someone said that he's not a jazz fusion musician. This is a very complex thing to address, actually. Keith Jarrett's relation to rock music is very interesting, and his proclamation that he doesn't like electric music is probably true, but there are instances where he goes against that. If you want to really hear that and explore some of the really, you know, bizarre albums that Keith Jarrett makes, go right back to the beginning of his career with Restoration Row, where he makes a sort of post-Bob Dylan blues album where he doesn't play keyboards, he sings his sort of folk songs. Go back and listen to it. And so this gospel sound that he brings in the 1970s, that's also in this group. Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette are just, it's sublime. Let's move to number 5. At number 5, I've got Little Creatures by Talking Heads. This is the one that had the hit records on Road to Nowhere.
We're on a road to nowhere.
This album, when it came out, was the album in terms of pop albums. I wasn't listening to that much pop music in 1985. I was deeply ensconced in my prog and jazz fusion. I was listening to stuff from the 70s. I was at a right, you know, disconnect from all my friends at that time. There was very few albums that came out in the rock realm in this year. We hadn't gone to sort of that. I hadn't picked up quite on the thrash metal bands. I know Anthrax had brought out Spreading the Disease, and I hadn't heard that. I brought Among the Living in 1986. And a lot of this had to do with leaving my town. I got out of my town in 1986 and went to college. In 85, I was still, you know, in my hometown with a much blinkered view. One of the albums that permeated, because it had hit records, was Little Creatures by Talking Heads. And I was already a fan of Talking Heads because I was a big fan of Adrian Belew, Brian Eno, and I'd got the Remaining Light album, which is one of the greatest albums ever made. This is also a brilliant album. There was a number of albums coming out of this time, like Brothers in Arms was one. Everyone had to have that. Graceland by Paul Simon. Everyone had to have that. There's a whole bunch of albums those are what my friends were listening to. Talking Heads was in that bracket, but the production and the approach didn't seem to fall into the horrendous production things that were going on in the 1980s that time. That's what I got at number 5 is Little Creatures. Now, I had the album, I listened to it. I can't tell you that much about it. If I was talking about Remaining Light, I'd have more to say. But this was a very important album. I think it's an absolutely fantastic album. My head wasn't into this at all. This is the problem. This is like, it was almost like, I know it's a great album, and there's the album I got at number 1 is like this. It's a pop album, really, and it's one of the few pop albums that I listened to. The one at number 1 I just listened to over and over again, but this one not so much. I put this here because it's not one of my favourite albums, but I know of the sort of pop and rock albums that are coming out in 85, Little Creatures should be up there. It's one of the great albums, in my opinion. It's very hard to discuss this. It's got to be on the list. Shall I get back to what I know? At number 4, I got Still Warm by John Scofield. John Scofield's solo career is quite interesting. Of course, he comes to prominence in Billy Cobham, in the Billy Cobham band, you know, in the mid-70s, and then he starts making solo albums because of that. And they're quite esoteric. He hasn't quite got that sort of bluesy, you know, hobo type style mixed in with a sort of post-Wes Montgomery, Jim Hall approach on guitar. And throughout the early 80s, you start to see that style emerge, which I think happens because of him getting the gig with Miles Davis, and Miles Davis would have pushed him to that much more sort of blues approach. And you can hear that emerging. He first crops up on Star People, and the star of the show on that album, as far as I'm concerned, is Mike Stern. And then on the albums Decoy, you know, and then You're Under Arrest, which also comes out in 85, Scofield starts to emerge. The year before this, he brings out Electric Outlet, which for me is undone by just too studio-y and overdubby. Here he puts a band together, and the following year he's going to put a new band together with Dennis Chambers on drums, Gary Granger on bass, and the various keyboardists. And that band is going to, for me, change the shape of jazz fusion. It was really interesting. But here he puts another band together specifically to do this album. And he's got Omar Hakim on drums, Don Grolnick on keyboards, the great arranger as well, Don Grolnick, who died far too young. And it's got Darryl Jones on bass. So it's basically got Sting's rhythm section here on this album. And Still Warm, for me, is the first masterpiece of many masterpieces that Scofield's going to make. And it sort of still remains, I think it's my favourite Scofield album, if I really sit back, because I bought this when this came out. It just blew me away. It was funky, it was soulful, it was fiery. I like the production on it. You know, it's a great album. So that's why I got number 4 on this list is Still Warm by John Scofield, another essential jazz rock album from 1985, from the 1980s. At number 3, I have Decode Yourself by Ronald Shannon Jackson and the Decoding Society. Now, this album is just mind-blowing. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming out of the prime time Ornette Coleman band at this point. Bill Laswell's exploring really interesting stuff at this point. For me, the great album of 85, which is exploring these areas, is Decode Yourself, produced by Bill Laswell. And this album contains a sort of cream of the sort of New York avant-garde jazz, which are much more fiery and a lot more edge than the sort of West Coast jazz musicians that are sort of filling up all these Fusac albums. The star of the show on this, for me, is Vernon Reid. And Vernon Reid is exploring a sort of scorching, Sonny Sharrock, blues-induced Hendrix, Eddie Van Halen approach to guitar, which you'd never heard before. And when he just bombs in with this sort of avant-garde alternate pick frenzy on the second track after they've opened up with their version of Bebop by Charlie Parker, which just really sits this album in a certain place, I was just blown away by this, so much so that when I had heard a few years later that he was putting a rock band together, I went and bought it straight away and went to see Living Colour, which was the band he then went into, on the Anthrax tour a few years later. And for me, the Living Colour blew Anthrax off the stage at that point. Vernon Reid then has become a legendary guitarist, a very influential guitarist on me in terms of my guitar playing. Now, Decode Yourself is what we would call a harmolodic album. It's coming out of the explorations that Ornette Coleman had started off in the mid-70s, where he then starts to experiment with rock and disco beats and James Brown beats. And this stuff is one of the few things throughout the 80s that was proper heavy, mind-blowing jazz rock. Bill Laswell picks up on this and he starts to explore that music. If you listen to his solo album, Bass Desires, you can hear that being explored there. And so him being brought in on production, and at this point, his production sound is very reggae influenced. He also was producing around this time Orgasmatron by Motorhead. Right, he's got the band Last Exit, and there's this actually very dirty rock sound that is applied onto this that we're going to hear the following year on one of the greatest albums of the 1980s, which is album by Pill. And Decode Yourself's a really, really important album. Ronald Shannon Jackson is one of my favourite drummers. I am a fusion guy. I do like Vinnie Colaiuta and Dave Weckl, all that slick drumming, but for me, when I want to explore another area of drumming and get more out there, there's certain drummers that are touchstones for me. And within the fusion realm, it's Ronald Shannon Jackson. He plays the drums like nobody else. It's joyful. It's drummy. He's got a sense of the drums. With the great free musicians, which is what Ronald Jackson fundamentally is. There is a future way of thinking, especially in the way he deals with rhythm, but there is also an ability to go right back to ancient history and the mysteries of the past and African music and where the source comes from. And that's what you hear here. And his way of playing is far more intuitive than the jazz rock players. That's what I've got at number 3. Decode Yourself by Ronald Shannon Jackson. At number 2, I've got Metal Fatigue by Allan Holdsworth. I mean, that was number 1. I've done the objective thing. I thought, no, the number 1 needs to be number 1. But if it was totally what I think, the greatest album of 1985 is Metal Fatigue. Allan Holdsworth is the greatest guitarist that's ever lived. He is one of the most important improvising musicians of the last 50 years. He's one of the most important jazz composers. He's one of the most important fusion musicians. He's one of the most important prog musicians. Yes, prog musicians. Allan Holdsworth came to fame working in the realm of progressive rock, playing with bands like Soft Machine and Gong, and UK. He's a prog musician. And in the early 80s, when he hooks up with Gary Husband, and he's now able, because of having Gary in the band, to play his own compositions, which are so much more advanced than anything he's doing in UK and Gong, you start to hear Holdsworth as a composer. Everyone's discussing him. Eddie Van Halen's a fan. All guitarists are just bowing down to them, but this guitarist is doing impossible things on guitar, which is compounded by the fact that Holdsworth seems to have a deep self-loathing, where he hates anyone saying he's any good. And because of this, he gets a major label deal with Warner Brothers through Eddie Van Halen, and they bring in Van Halen's Ted Templeton to produce it. It's a disaster. Holdsworth can't take it. He can't take being squeezed. And, if he had let them do what they wanted to do, he may have become a household name. He may have ended up living in a big house and been able to do proper gigs and pay some money rather than living almost on the borderline destitute for the rest of his life. But he wouldn't change his music for us. He wouldn't compromise. So we get Road Games coming out, which is a mini album, brilliant album. And then he moves to a much smaller label. And I feel that Metal Fatigue is where he pulls together an idea that he turns away from. He pulls together the heavy metal aspects of his composition, the jazz rock aspects of his composition, the progressive rock aspects of his composition, and he pulls it all onto this album. This album's got vocals. It's got Paul Williams on vocals. It's got epics that go through chapters. It's got like tight, almost like pop songs with drum machines on them. It's probably Holdsworth's most widest and eclectic album, and it became the album because of the title and the cover more than anything else, because it's not a heavy metal album, but there is, on the opening track, some heavy metal riffage. And so the metalers love this album, and of course the guitar solos are absolutely incredible. Gary Husband's off the scale. It's also got Chad Wackham on, who comes in, and there's this sort of balance between his American group, because he's gone to America, and his British group. And for me, Metal Fatigue is almost like, if you're going to buy a solo album by Holdsworth, it's the album. And it's accessible, but with Devil Take the Hindmost, he makes a statement on guitar, which I feel is the statement. It's full of so much stuff, this album is. There's so much stuff on it. It's a great album. And for those of you that find 16 Men of Tame very jazzy and a hard one to listen through, this is the album to go for. It's an incredible album. And I think it is my favourite album in 1985. But at number 1, I have got Hounds of Love by Kate Bush. We're back to the pop album. One of the greatest pop albums of the 1980s, Hounds of Love. And one of the greatest progressive rock albums. Right, this is where she did 2 things. On side 1, she consolidates herself as a pop artist and writes some of the most accessible pop singles, which do not compromise what she has explored up until that point. But things like, Cloud Busting and Running Up That Hill and Hounds of Love, these are classic singles of the 1980s, which recently, when they were featured in Strange Things, propelled Kate Bush back into the mainstream cultural limelight. And she had a hit across the whole world with the tracks on this album. Hounds of Love is one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. If I said that Hounds of Love was the greatest album of the 1980s, what would you think? But what's interesting is you turn it over onto side 2, and we have a side-long progressive rock epic about witches, about being stranded with ghosts and all sorts of stuff going on. And it goes off the scale. And there's moments where she is able to explore a sort of virtuosity that we associate with progressive rock by aligning it with sort of Irish folk music, so that the people at the time that were very snotty about that style of music couldn't complain. Hounds of Love is a great album. Is it my favourite album by Kate Bush? No, my favourite album by Kate Bush is the one that went before, The Dreaming, where she really is pushing the envelope. And I also love very much Never Forever, and possibly even The Sensual World I enjoy more than Hounds of Love. But this is absolutely a great album, and possibly the apex of Kate Bush's career as well, and rightly should go at number 1. And so with that, I get to the end of this video, where I've looked at my 10 favourite the greatest albums of 1985. All these albums are going to be 40 years old this year, which is quite astounding, because when I think back to my, putting Wogan on, which is a talk show here in the UK, and seeing Kate Bush, re-emerging out of obscurity because she'd been gone for quite a long time, with 2 drummers in the background with no cymbals doing the Hounds of Love, and going, what is this, and being really excited by this new music that was coming out by Kate Bush, and to think it's 40 years ago. Unbelievable. If you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more, please subscribe. I have a Patreon where you can support me financially by becoming a paid up member and getting access to a whole bunch of stuff. Or you can become a free member, and there's still a bunch of stuff for the free members. If you want to support me financially, there's 2 ways of doing that now. You can go to my PayPal tip jar and drop some money in there, or put some money into this little button that's down here that's got the little heart shape on. I think it's down there. It's down there somewhere though, and you can like give me a little tip, a little boost. That's very useful. I can go and buy myself some biscuits and maybe some scarf, because at the moment I'm freezing cold. I'm going to have to put my heater on. I didn't put it on because I didn't want the sound of the fan heater in the background. So people go, what's that sound in the background? I go, it's my fan heater because I'm freezing cold. But, when I move to 1995, you'll hear a new noise tomorrow when we move to that one. Also, as I'm telling you, there's a new thing. I have moved my Bandcamp for subscription, so for the price of one album you can listen to the whole lot. And since I've moved it to subscription, I've become a lot more laissez-faire, let us say, in terms of releasing music, and I've released 3 albums already. So I will be going a lot more experimental and bringing a lot more stuff out, which maybe I'd think, I don't want to put this up on my Bandcamp and pretend it's like a great big new release. I don't like albums anymore. I don't like the bloody tyranny of the album anymore. I want to be, if I want to just come down here and plug my guitar and improvise for an hour and put that out, I want to be able to do it. I might record an album, just drum solos. I want to be able to do all this stuff, or talking, or jamming and stuff like that. That's what I want to be able to do. And my computer's full of tracks that I could mix off and you can have a listen to, and you can just get it all for the cost of one album, which is great. So if you want to go over to my Bandcamp, the link's down below. Also, I've set up a Substack, and on there you can become a free member or a paid member. If you want to read the articles that I'm putting up, essays, you have to pay. And the reason is that there's going to be quite a lot of contentious political stuff on there, and I only want to engage with people that seriously want to engage in it. I'm sick of people who don't get it sort of chiming in and then end up it cascading off into areas that can be quite disastrous for me, to be honest. So the sort of more political, cultural stuff is behind a paywall, and there's the last essay I put up, which is about Martin's Speak, and we got Martin Speak coming on the channel. He's been on the channel by now, hasn't he? So that's probably created a great big bloody hoo-ha. But if you want to go listen to the podcast, a lot of the interviews I've got up are on Substack, and you can listen to them there. They're also mirrored onto Spotify. So if you're on Spotify, you can find it's called Andy Edwards Interviews, but it's going to have a whole bunch of stuff on there. So that's it. I'm done. What we just done 1985. I've got 2 more to do. So I've got 2 more to do. So tomorrow we'll be doing 1995. I'll see you then. I hope you're enjoying this thing. And I'm going to get off and go and do that one now.
don't want them drawn out, Richard. I'm getting scared now.